Thanks for being here, Anna. I'm so happy to have you, and I'm excited to hear you read. So the BSc metaphorical floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to you and to BSc for this invitation to read. I'm going to be reading just a very brief excerpt from a new novel that's, it's just out, not out published, out with my agent as we speak. So I hope I don't jinx it. It's been a slog of a novel for me to write because I started it 10 years ago and it's changed so much. It's almost a completely different work from what I began with it. But I've learned a lot about it, about the novel itself and the characters in that time. So it's been time well spent in that sense. So it's called The Apartment, and it takes place in a Art Deco building in Miami's South Beach. And it traces the lives, just brief moments in the lives of a lot of characters, a lot of residents, people who have lived in that, starting with 1942 all the way to through 2012. And so each chapter is a snippet of somebody's life. These are a lot of mostly immigrants, mostly people who have been running from something. There are ghosts of all sorts involved. And then the second part of the novel takes place in 2012, and the threads from the beginning hopefully come together in that second part. But I'm going to be reading from part one, and it's one of the last installments in that part one. And all of these chapters, we'll call them, have a name of the main character and the year that it's taking place. So this is, and I've cut this down a little bit. And it's this is called Pilar, 2009. And it's in the voice of a reporter, kind of a salty reporter. So my advanced apologies to anyone who's offended by the language. I'll just go ahead and start reading. Pilar pulls the tape across the top and seals the last box. Books. It's taken the move for her to realize that most of what she owns is in words. 13 boxes of books, 7 boxes of notebooks, 5 boxes of kitchen stuff, 3 wardrobe-style boxes of clothes. She's already gotten rid of her suits. And 1 box of office supplies, most of them stolen over the years from the horror. Words, words, words. Words on Facebook, 15 fantastically passive-aggressive notes. Words on Twitter, outrageous, followed by a stupid link that she'll click anyways. Words in the mail, you owe blah, blah, blah. What's the point of it? What did all the books give her? She's forgotten most of what she's read. And anyway, it's no way to make a living. Even less so now when every jackass is a citizen journalist. Her mother warned her 20 years ago. Pilar hates to admit she was right. So this is it. Pilar sits on a box of hardcovers, her life in 22 boxes. Pilar is being melodramatic. Fuck it, she's 40 years old and she's moving back in with her parents. She can be as maudlin about it as she likes. The real estate lady just left, Anna something or the other, but not Cuban. Pilar signed all the forms without reading them. Her brother, my son the doctor, as her mother refers to him, is coming by in an hour to help her haul most of this junk to storage. And tonight she'll sleep in her old bedroom in her parents' house. Next Monday, someone else, someone she has never met, will start living in her apartment for $1,900 a month. The best income, even after maintenance and taxes, that she's seen in more than a year. Pilar is a victim of the financial crisis, a term she abhors, really, mostly because of its anxiety to appear inoffensive. Financial crisis. Everyone repeats it as if it were a perfectly acceptable term for the soul-mangling, no-turning-back, fucking utter disaster that ruined her life. Pilar's the worst offender, she admits it. She's lost count of how many times she's used that stupid phrase in cover letters. After the financial crisis, I took stock of my talents or following the financial crisis, I decided to reinvent myself as a blah, blah, blah. All desperate nonsense, which nobody bought, not least of all Pilar. Words. She has no illusions. She was a reporter for almost 20 years. An unfortunate side effect of such a long internment is that your capacity for your own bullshit becomes severely constrained. The truth, the harsh, no holds barred reality is that Pilar is a loser. She was trained to see things plainly, and now she cannot turn away from herself. She has lost at the game. What's worse is that even in her suffering, she can make no claim to greatness. Hers is not a particularly interesting or original story. Earlier this year, after 18 years with the Miami horror, which HR decided to calculate down to 8 years because of an ill-advised leave that she took in 2001, cuando se enfermó de los nervios, Pilar was involuntarily separated. Involuntary separation. That's what they call fired now. Lord Jesus, why aren't people rioting in the streets to defend the English language? But so it goes. An institution that's so long trafficked in precise language, at least when it came to the suffering of others, took refuge in corporate babble when it came to reckoning with its own crimes. Involuntary separation. Her editor gave her the news over the phone. 2 days later, she was signing a certificate of separation, which included a clause stipulating that in return for her laughable hush money, $18,000 after taxes, she promised not to trash her idiotic former employers. Fuck them. The enormity of it didn't hit her at once. Pilar assumed she would be able to find a job elsewhere. Pilar is Cuban, Miami-born. Miami, for better or worse, usually worse, is home. She went to elementary and high school here, parochial schools. She graduated college from here. She got her first job here. Her entire family is here, 7 cousins, 8 aunts and uncles, 2 sets of grandparents, 1 still living, 1,000 friends and acquaintances, memories of hurricanes, some vicious, some empty threats, Swap Shop, Westchester Mall, Big Things Saying, Lourdes Academy, enormous stakes at El Cristo, Europa Shoes, MDCC. Pilar cannot conceive of living anywhere else. For several months after her firing, Pilar lived in dreamland. She continued her Wednesday ritual of lunch at Books and Books and kept up her Saturday night visits to Duffy's, secure in the delusion that she was still wanted. As summer turned to fall, reality began to intrude, which is to say, Pilar began to run out of money. She sent out a few resumes and emails, but after 18 years as an investigative reporter in Miami, the last 2 as a columnist, she'd managed to piss off every major employer in town. Working for the county was out, of course, as was the city of Miami. Same went for the university, Tetra Associates, the TANR Group, Von Arts. The list was depressingly long. She wrote a few magazine articles, How to Tell If Your Man Is Lying to You, that kept her afloat for a while. She tried writing for one of those internet mills, lasted half a day. Most recently, she landed an adjunct position at a community college in North Broward. The pay barely covered gas money. After taxes and maintenance on the condo, she was in the red. And she didn't have health insurance on top of everything. Something had gone wrong in this country between the time she graduated from high school and the time she found herself in middle age, broke and without prospects. What was it exactly? Where had they all failed one another? As a columnist, she was paid to know, or at least pretend to know. She wrote angry columns, funny columns, boring columns, every one of them filled with the certainty of the second rate. Her ex-husband, that London-born worm, had a bunch of British sayings, and that was his favorite, supposedly originating as a dig at Margaret Thatcher. She has the certainty of the second rate. He never told her this one to her face, but she can imagine him applying it to her now. Yes, Pilar will be honest with herself. She has a second-rate intelligence. Why else would she have married that serial 2-timing jackass? Why else would she be in the mess she is now? Certainty. Bush was certain that Afghanistan was worth invading. She was certain it was not. Bush was certain that capitalism would save the world. She was certain it would not. But even as she wrote her columns, she had her doubts. No one wants to read about your doubts, her editor had shouted at her. But why not? Why couldn't one have doubts and express them publicly? Why couldn't she say now, for all the world to read, that she doesn't know what went wrong with America in the years between her adolescence and middle age? How is it that her parents, barely a decade after their arrival, were able to send their 2 children to private school, own a home, drive 2 cars, and vacation on the beach every summer for 3 weeks. In those early years before they both struck it rich in their careers, did her parents ever worry about health insurance? Not that she can remember. Were they just shielding Pilar and her brother from hard realities? Unlikely, as her father's specialty was creating and wallowing in communal anxiety. What was it? Was it really Reagan's fault, all those crazies he let back out on the street? Or was it Clinton and his easy mortgages? Now that no one is paying her for her opinion, Pilar can admit that she doesn't really have one, that the air went out of her long ago. It's all too complicated, beyond her sorting. All she knows for certain now is that someone really fucked her over. So Pilar has made the decision. She will move back in with her parents, temporarily, and rent out this cucarachera that she and her husband bought for a mere $80,000 in 2003 when the building went condo. 3 years later, just in time for her divorce, this dump had been appraised at $350,000. In the first of what would be a series of stupid financial moves, Pilar bought out her ex-husband, with the neat little result that in 2009, she finds herself like every other surviving moron in South Beach, owing more on the apartment than it's worth. Forget the fancy language of the agents. Here's the deep structure of the Florida real estate market. It's nothing more than a 2 million strong game of hot potato. First, the prices start rising. Then developers of new construction hire trapeze artists. Then your uncle tells you about a friend who has a cousin whose orthodontist bought a condo on Friday for 40 grand and flipped it on Monday for 600,000. And you're the poor idiot who buys the condo for 600,000, expecting it to double in value in a week, and then boom, you're left holding what we'll politely call the soft, smelly, steaming spud. This happened to a lot of people. Pilar certainly wasn't the only one. Hers wasn't even the worst case. It only seems like it to Pilar. Some people walked away from the bad debt, just stopped paying, figured if it's good enough for American Airlines, it's good enough for me. But Pilar isn't built like that. She comes from solid northern Spanish stock, Galicia on her father's side, Asturias on her mother's. They prided themselves on a kind of high-minded thriftiness that hasn't been spotted in the United States since the Dutch founded Manhattan. When her mother's parents arrived in Miami in 1965, they already held doctorates in financial fuck-ups. From damp outhouses in Oviedo, they had traveled to Cuba on steerage in the early 20th century, and in 30 years had made fortunes being the nastiest bunch of penny-pinching grocers the island had ever known. Their refusal to pay for anything they could do themselves, their insistence on resoling a single pair of shoes to last them 100 years, their horror of buying anything new or at full price made them exotic anywhere, doubly so in the America of self-help optimism. But Pilar's parents and uncles and grandparents knew that money never lasts, that forces beyond your control can quickly conspire to rob you of a very nice pension. It took one look at the free-spending Americans and instantly understood the secret workings of the US economy. With frugal peasants like us, declared one uncle, this country would never progress. Pilar's plan is to rent out the apartment and net a little extra cash each month while she plots her next move. Never mind the walls are like literally made of paper, that mice overrun the attic, and that an actual real-life madman lives below. The place photographs nice, typical self. But for this plot to work, of course, she would have to find a way to live rent-free. Like countless other Gen Xers, she has opted to move back in with her parents. It was an obvious choice. Her father, now retired, had been a vice president for an international medical equipment firm. Her mother is a well-known fashion designer who still lends her name to a line of jewelry sold first at Bird Eyes and then picked up by Macy's. I'm going to skip a little bit. Marco is knocking at Pilar's door. She breathes in once, twice. She waits a moment. She must be sure to put on her best smile. Her parents wanted Pilar to be a lawyer naturally. A doctor would have been better, but they figured early on she didn't have the head or stomach for it. One of the most disappointing days in their lives was when she told them she was going to go work for the Miami Horror. In Cuba, the lowest people were the journalists, said her mother. The job won't even cover the price of gas, said her mom. Now that she's moving back with them, they're finally happy. Cuban parents aren't like normal parents. They like having their kids near, proximity being conducive to the kind of micromanaged parenting style they prefer. Pilar's brother lived with them all through medical school, a brilliant financial decision that their parents more than 20 years later still find time to praise. Pilar had teased him for that mercilessly over the years, so when weighing the decision to move back into their parents' house, the thought that gave her the most pause was what her brother would say. Pilar and Marco have a good enough rapport now, maintained by distance, but Marco has always been the typical oldest child and typical Cuban son. Pilar became a feminist in 1985, the day her mother, paying no matter to the fact that Pilar was lying on the couch blissfully engrossed in a book, asked her to make her brother a sandwich. Pobrecito, her mother called from her workroom. The pobrecito was tired after football practice, and that's how it always went. Marco was pobrecito, and Pilar had malas pulgas. Pilar opens the door and kisses her brother. She smiles as genuinely as she can. So all right, Marco says, let's do this. Marco helps her load her things onto the truck. They make 4 trips, and on the 5th, Pilar, exhausted, drops the big living room lamp and it shatters. Almost instantly comes the shouting from below, knock it off, bitch. Without having to pause to consider anything, Pilar stomps her foot. You knock it off, asshole. Keep it up and I'll rent this place to a circus troupe. Calm down, Marco tells her. Guy's a fucking maniac, she says. I'm sick of him. When all the boxes are gone, Pilar closes the door behind her without looking back. Did you find a tenant? Her brother says once they're on the highway. Yeah, the agent did, Pilar says. Some recent arrival. Oh? Some Cuban. Lenin Garcia. Lenin? Her brother asks, as in Can't Buy Me Love? No, Lenin, Pilar says, as in capitalism is fascism in decay. That's the end of that excerpt.
Thank you, Anna. It's so fun to hear this character, Pilar. I just want to let anyone, so whoever's in attendance, if you want, we're going to have a short conversation, and you can feel free to unmute and ask a question directly, or you can drop a question into the chat and I can read it for Anna. And so you said that that this novel took you 10 years to write, and it's evolved and morphed and changed. And I was, and that you learned a lot during the process of writing it. And I was wondering how that metamorphosis took shape as it progressed. Like, was it an idea, or did you already know that the structure of the apartment would be the way that you were going to move around with characters? I'm interested in the process.
Yes, no, it's a good question. It evolved painfully. And I knew the structure is the only thing that really stayed the same. I always knew it was going to be this apartment. And I knew that we were going to be going into the lives of different people, because the idea was that we live alone, we live separately, and we live with our sorrows and our problems, and no one helps us a lot of times. And that was the extent of it. The way that I originally conceived it, it had all of these stories happen after a person takes his life in the apartment, and it was a person nobody helped, nobody paid attention to. And then a friend of mine, Isabel Alvarez Borland, who's a wonderful critic, and she's read every single version of this. She's a saint, and she loved that version. But there was something that she said that stayed with me. She said, and all these people talking about their lives, not one of them cared about this person. And that was true. And I thought, well, what if somebody had? And that's what changed, not just the final shape of the novel and the ending, that change the theme in a way, you know, and I never start when I'm writing, I never start with theme. And I always tell my students, don't start with theme, you know, it'll be so flat and horrible and, you know, so I never start with theme, and theme always develops, sometimes painfully, sometimes it takes 10 years. But I realized that that's what I was writing towards. I was writing towards, you know, what do we owe each other? You know, living in these big cities in our own little bubbles. And all of this, I wrote all of this before COVID. But I think it resonates even more now because, you know, we have realized that we do not exist by ourselves, even though we like to pretend that we do. And so the second part, you know, examines that. You know, what if somebody had cared for somebody who was in pain? How might an ending be different? And then I was, you know, I liked all the versions. My agent was less enthusiastic of some of the earlier versions. And we're finally on the same page, and she really finally loved it. And it took 10 years to get there because, again, I don't plot out, and I don't start with any big ideas. I start with a character and then, you know, a couple characters around that character. And then, you know, theme starts to, you know, it started to become an idea of immigrants, of people who have lost, of people who are displaced, because that is Miami. I mean, that's pretty easy.
Yeah.
But then what does all that mean? And I don't know as the writer. I have to discover it. And that's what takes 10 years.
Well, no, I mean, you're doing a lot of other things in between, you know. And
I was raising a child. I had a
yes,
baby, you know,
yes,
right after my last book was published. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're a full-time professor, and you know, you have other duties and other ways that you serve, you know, the literary community, including doing these types of readings. So thank you for being here. But I'm fascinated by like the time period that you set it in, and because it's both like contemporary, but it's interesting how, like you said, 1942 to 1912, and it's interesting
2012.
oh yes, sorry, 2012. Yeah. That you know, that anything around, like, you know, September 11th probably has to be like, you know, sorry, this is not a question. My comment is like, you know, like the financial crisis you have to touch on, like, how much do you touch on, you know, September 11th? And then now I've heard writers who like had books that were like in 2018, 2019, 2020, and how they're moving the time period back because you can't not talk about COVID in a contemporary novel now, that it just has to appear, like, because if you're writing something that's in recent memory, those references have to be made in some ways. And I appreciated, like, you mentioned Reagan and Clinton, and yeah.
Yeah, no, that's another really great question, because the time, you know, matters. It does. And I didn't realize how much it mattered until I had written it. And so what it does is that it starts with World War II. And it really is about war in a lot of ways. I mean, it isn't exactly about war, but it is about war's aftermath. In other words, it's about the displaced of war. And by the violence that kind of seeps out of war. So that, you know, I didn't mean to do it about that, but I noticed that there was violence always at the periphery of these stories. So we have World War II shadows the first story, and then there's the Vietnam War, and then there's America's wars of intervention in Latin America also feature in here in the 80s. And then you know, you get to September 11th features. It's a peripheral story, and it comes back in part two, and it's very much in the background because I feel like September 11th is such a potent event that I at least have to treat it glancing in a glancing way, and it has to, in this case, in this book, it serves the bigger point of how alone we tend to live. So there's an attack that may be related to the anti-Muslim and anti-Arab violence in the building, and nobody saw anything, nobody knows anything. And then it becomes something else, right? In part two, we learned it's a little bit more complicated. But all of these things started to figure into the narrative and into the story I was telling. And then the reason it ends in 2012 is because the last tenant that I write about comes from a posting in Cairo. And then we have the Arab Spring that features in there, and an incredible violence with the Arab Spring. Originally, the story ended in 2016 and on the eve of Trump's election. That's what originally where this book was by the time I had gotten to that section. And then I pulled back on that because that also is, it would take it away from what was developing, you know, although there is, for the close reader, there is, I hope, a foreshadowing that they will see. But I did want to move it back and keep it, you know, with the Arab Spring and a particular act of violence which changes the life of this tenant.
Okay. And is that tenant Pilar? Like, are we the closest to Pilar? So are we never close to one particular tenant ever?
Not really.
It just moves. Yeah. It's like a kind of like a more like a kaleidoscope effect.
Yeah, exactly. Although the last tenant, we do get more time with her.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and is it all close third throughout, or are there any like moments of first person?
It's all close third, although there are moments of first person in the second piece. I play around with point of view in the second part, and hopefully in a way that will maybe delight is too strong a word, but that will amuse writers because of the way that I use the first person and the third person.
Oh, okay.
Part two. I was just having fun with it, you know? Even though it's a tragic story. So I mean, you know, one of the things with a novel of this, structure is that, you know, some very, very sad and tragic and horrible things happen. But, you know, life also has light moments. It also has funny moments. It also has people like Pilar who are, you know, kind of funny in their anger and things like that.
Yeah, I love her sense of humor that really came through, especially in the dialogue.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted that because, you know, that's our experience of life as well, even when things are very tragic. That, you know, there are some people who have this kind of mordant sense of absurdity, and that's also true of life.
Yeah. So I'm interested in books that do alternate point of view and in the ways in which how that is a challenge for the writer to consider the hierarchy, if there's ever a hierarchy in perspective and who's telling what part of the story, and also if it sounds like I love how the building is the structure, like the physical structure of the building is also the structure for the novel. Like both, like there's the physicality, like both literal of a building, and then also like the metaphorical, like of each little story in its own little box.
And the apartment actually does have a role also. The apartment is a presence itself.
Oh, okay.
And yes, so
absolutely. And you said there are ghosts too.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Yeah, so but absolutely. And I mean, when in the first version of this, they were in first person. They were kind of first person monologues. I was very influenced by Svetlana Alexievich's Secondhand Time and just what she does with the oral history format. I mean, that's an actual historical document which she's writing. This is fiction, but just having characters speak their stories felt very modern and true to me as a way to tell a story. And in this final version, I reverted to a close third. So the third is sometimes very close, as in the case of Pilar, and sometimes a little bit ironically distanced. And the reason for that, there are many kind of boring, writerly, overly thought out reasons. But one of them is this sense of another consciousness that's telling these stories throughout. So that's who knows if that will be successful, but that's that's the idea.
Yeah, like the building itself has a consciousness. Right. Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited. I feel like I got like I'm so excited for, what the next steps with your agent for this project. And yes, like, I'm right there with you. Yeah, I think we can wrap early if you want, but I was wondering if you're reading anything or if you're enjoying teaching anything right now. Yeah. And also I was wondering, like, how much did you do a lot of research? It sounds like maybe you did also a lot of research for this novel too.
I did. I read a lot of different Miami Beach. A lot of it didn't make it in because I cut, but this was a really great book that I read, and I'm still reading, and I'm still going back into it because I stopped about where I needed to stop for the research, but I want to go back to it because it's a great history of Miami Beach.
Oh, okay, amazing.
And gave me a lot of, just, I think when you're writing, I'm not, how do I say this? Because I have a lot of friends who write very good historical fiction. I'm not as adept at historical fiction, either in reading it or in writing it. And so I was really wary of loading too many historical details. And it was a real problem for me at times. So I ended up taking a lot of details out. But I feel like the book is still helped inform the kind of feel for each chapter, in its historical context. So that book was really helpful. Right now, I'm rereading, because I had kind of read it many years ago and not paid much attention to it, but Caliban and the Witch, the Sylvia Federici, I think it is her name, who wrote this wonderful, it has nothing to do with what I'm writing, but it's just fascinating scholarly work on the witch hunts and the genocide of women, hundreds of thousands of women who were killed during the witch hunts in Europe and here. And it's just a fascinating book. It just makes me so angry. I tell people the older I get, the angrier I get. But I'm reading a couple of books at once. I'm rereading, for class. I'm rereading, of course, the stuff I'm teaching, and I'm reading and other. What's the name of that book? Somewhere in there. And I have like 3 or 4 books going at once, which I didn't used to, but I think we live in such a fragmented time also that
no, it's nice to choose different realities at different points in time.
Yeah, and
to read for one thing.
I don't have the cover on here because I've been reading it, but this fabulous book by Ada Ferrer, Cuba, an American history. It's a history of Cuba. And this book is fascinating because, as a Cuban American writer, I write a lot about Cuba. And I've done a lot of research on Cuba. I mean, I wrote a novel on Che Guevara, and I've read a bunch of books and histories, and everything written on him and written on the Cuban Revolution and so forth. And I thought that I knew, some Cuban history. And I've just been floored by this book of how much I did not know. Stories that there's so many novels in there, possibly if I were into writing historical fiction. Because it's just fascinating. One of the things that she does so well is what historians do, which I think is what novelists try to do, is to connect the dots, right? That one thing leads to another. The George Saunders said a story is an increasing series of escalations or something like that. And that's what history is. It's a series of escalations. And she does such a great job of tracing that, so you understand that the story we have today of Cuba is based on this and based on this and based on this, and the incredible power of race in Cuba, which is something that we still don't really talk about. We don't talk about it in exile, and we don't talk about it in the island, because in the island they solved it. They say they solved it, and so they don't really talk about it. And it's an issue that continues, and she covers it so well. I mean, that's her area of expertise.
Oh, okay.
So I really recommend the book. It's really fabulous. It's out now.
Wow, that's so exciting. And yeah, I it's interesting. I'm a very lazy researcher. And I feel like I would love to be better at that, but it's like you do so much and then none of it gets into the work. It's so
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of writers work this way. I'll write it and then I'll go and research and say, oh, I need this. I need, what kind of furniture would they have? I mean, I did a lot of searching through old Sears catalogs, for instance, and things like that. So that's fun. But yeah, I'm a super lazy researcher also. But then I go down a rabbit hole and I accumulate pages and pages of stuff that I feel, well, it's going to really overload it. And the thing is that when we're living a moment, we're not aware of, this brand and that brand, and, we're not aware of those things. And so there's no reason to put them in a narrative necessarily, right? So
right. Like the avocado green linoleum that I grew up with. And like
when you have it, you don't think of it. That's the floor. Right. The avocado, I grew up with an avocado green refrigerator. But nobody says, oh, I went into the avocado green refrigerator and got myself.
You just said, I opened the fridge. Yeah.
Right. So it's a find that balance.
But that color is so part of a time period.
I mean, they thought it looked good. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. I loved hearing that excerpt of your novel, and look forward to seeing whenever it comes out. And
thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
I really hope that your school year goes well, and that you stay safe, and that you and your family stay safe and well. And I hope to have you here at Vermont soon.
Thank you. I hope so too. Thanks again. It's been lovely.
Take care.